The gunshot that killed Preston Everhart's father echoed through his childhood. But it was his mother's departure 3 days later that truly destroyed him. She left a note on the kitchen table of their modest ranch house outside Pecos, Texas, explaining that she couldn't bear the memories, couldn't stay in a place that reminded her of death, couldn't raise a 10-year-old boy alone in this unforgiving land. Preston found it when he came in from feeding the horses, the ink already smudged from her tears. His aunt arrived that afternoon to collect him, her face pinched with obligation rather than love. He learned quickly that people left, that promises meant nothing when tested by hardship, that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. 20 years later, in the scorching summer of 1878, Preston had built a life around that bitter knowledge. His ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of West Texas scrubland, carved out through relentless work and careful distrust. He employed 6 men but kept them at arm's length, paying fair wages but never sharing meals, never asking about their families, never letting anyone close enough to matter. When they moved on, as they inevitably did, he felt nothing but mild inconvenience at having to replace them. The town of Pecos knew him as a hard man, fair but cold, someone who kept his word in business but offered nothing of himself. Women had tried over the years, drawn by his strong build and the success of his ranch, but Preston's rejections were swift and absolute. He'd watched too many men in town get their hearts broken when wives decided frontier life wasn't for them, when sweethearts chose easier paths back east, when promised devotion crumbled under the weight of isolation and hardship. He was 30 years old and had accepted his solitary existence as permanent when Katherine Walsh's stagecoach broke an axle 15 miles outside of town. Preston found her at sunset, standing beside the disabled coach with a composure that surprised him. The driver and guard had ridden into Pecos for help hours earlier, leaving her with the wreckage and her traveling trunk. Most women would have been crying or complaining, but Katherine simply stood in the shade of the damaged coach, her dark blonde hair escaping its pins in the hot wind, her green eyes assessing him with the same careful measurement he was applying to her. "The driver said someone would come," she said, her voice steady despite the heat that had to be exhausting her. She wore a practical traveling dress, already dusty from the road, and she didn't flutter or simper as she spoke. "I'm Katherine Walsh. I was meant to arrive in Pecos this morning to take up a teaching position." "Preston Everhart." He dismounted, leading his horse closer. "I've got a wagon about a mile back at my ranch. I can take you into town. Come back for your trunk tomorrow when they've got the stagecoach sorted." She studied him for a long moment, and he saw her taking in his worn boots, his sun-weathered face, the rifle on his saddle, making calculations about safety and propriety and necessity. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate it." He expected her to need help mounting his horse, but Katherine gathered her skirts efficiently and accepted his offered hand with practical firmness, settling behind him without fuss. She didn't chatter as they rode, didn't press against him more than necessary, didn't ask the endless questions most women seemed compelled to voice. The silence felt almost comfortable, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the ever-present wind. At his ranch, Preston brought out his wagon and hitched 2 horses while Katherine waited in the yard, looking around with obvious interest. His house was larger than most bachelor dwellings, built with his father's optimistic vision of a family that never materialized. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, the corrals sturdy, everything speaking to competence and prosperity without ostentation. "You've built something solid here," Katherine observed as he finished with the horses. "It's what the land demanded." He helped her onto the wagon seat, aware of how small her waist felt under his hands, then climbed up beside her. The ride into Pico's took nearly an hour in the fading light. As the sky turned purple and gold, Katherine finally broke the silence. "The driver mentioned you run cattle." "Some. Mostly horses. Better market for good horses with the cavalry forts and the ranches expanding." He glanced at her. "Why teaching? It's hard work out here and the pay is nothing compared to what you could get back east." "Who says I'm from back east?" There was amusement in her voice. "Your clothes, your speech, the way you're sitting like you expect the road to be smooth." Katherine laughed, a genuine sound that startled him. "Fair enough, I'm from Philadelphia, and I'm teaching here because I want to, not because I have no other options. I got tired of society expectations and predetermined paths. I wanted to make my own choices." Preston said nothing, but something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. He'd heard similar speeches before, from the few teachers who'd come through Pico's over the years. They all thought they wanted frontier independence until the reality of isolation and hardship set in. None had lasted more than a year. "You don't believe me," Katherine said quietly, reading his silence accurately. "Doesn't matter what I believe. You'll figure out what you want soon enough. And you think what I'll want is to leave." He pulled the wagon to a stop outside the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson kept rooms for single women. The lamp in the window cast warm light across Katherine's face, illuminating the determined set of her jaw. "I think people usually do what's easiest, not what they promise." "No offense intended." Katherine climbed down from the wagon without his assistance, turning to face him with her arms crossed. "I don't make promises lightly, Mr. Everhart. When I commit to something, I see it through. You'll learn that about me. Maybe." He tipped his hat, already dismissing the conversation. "Welcome to Pico's, Miss Walsh." He didn't expect to see her again beyond passing on the street, but Pico's was a small town and Katherine Walsh proved impossible to avoid. She took over the schoolhouse with efficient determination, arriving early and staying late, winning over the skeptical parents with genuine interest in their children. Preston heard about it from his ranch hands, from the shopkeepers when he bought supplies, from Mrs. Henderson, who couldn't stop praising the new teacher's sensibility and grit. 3 weeks after her arrival, Katherine showed up at his ranch on a borrowed horse, sitting the saddle with decent if unpracticed form. Preston was breaking a young gelding in the corral when he saw her approaching. He finished his work before walking over, wiping sweat from his face with his sleeve. "Something wrong, Miss Walsh. I wanted to thank you properly for helping me that first day." She dismounted carefully, reaching into her saddlebag. "And to return this." She held out his canteen, which he'd forgotten he'd given her during the hot ride to town. "You didn't need to ride all the way out here for that." "Perhaps not." Katherine smiled, and he noticed how the sun had already begun to bronze her skin, how her hands showed the beginnings of calluses from frontier work. "But I also wanted to ask your advice. Several of my students come from ranching families, and they've been asking questions about livestock management and land stewardship that I'm not qualified to answer. I wondered if you might be willing to speak to the class sometime, share some practical knowledge." Preston frowned. "I'm no teacher." "You don't have to be. Just tell them what you know about building something lasting out here. Show them that success is possible with hard work and dedication." She paused. "Most of these children will spend their lives on ranches or farms. Anything practical you could share would be valuable." He should have refused, should have sent her on her way and maintained his careful distance. But something in her earnest request, in the way she'd thought about what her students actually needed rather than just teaching them from books, made him hesitate. "One time, I'll come once." Katherine's smile widened. "Thank you, that's all I ask." She visited again the following week to arrange the details, and somehow ended up staying for supper when the discussion ran long. Preston's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, an older Chinese woman whose family had settled in Texas after working the railroads, seemed delighted to have a woman at the table and prepared enough food for 5 people. Katherine asked thoughtful questions about ranch operations, listening carefully to Preston's explanations about water rights, grazing rotation, and the delicate balance between building a herd and maintaining the land. "Your father taught you all this?" Katherine asked as they finished eating. Preston's jaw tightened. "Some. He died when I was young. I figured out the rest myself. I'm sorry." Her sympathy sounded genuine without the false platitudes most people offered. "That must have been incredibly difficult. It was a long time ago." He stood, gathering plates to end the conversation. "I'll come by the school Friday afternoon." Katherine rose as well, not pressing for information he clearly didn't want to share. "Friday afternoon. I'll make sure the children are prepared with questions." After she left, Mrs. Chen gave him a knowing look as she took the dishes. "She is good woman, smart, not afraid of work." "She's a teacher doing her job," Preston said flatly. Mrs. Chen's tone suggested she disagreed but wouldn't argue. "She come back, I think." Preston told himself it didn't matter if Katherine came back or not, that he felt nothing about her one way or another. But when Friday came, he found himself changing into a clean shirt before riding into town, and when Katherine smiled at him in front of the classroom of eager children, something long dormant stirred in his chest. The talk went better than expected. The children asked intelligent questions about horse breeding, about managing water during dry seasons, about the business aspects of ranching. Katherine watched from the back of the room, occasionally adding her own questions that showed she'd been paying attention during their supper conversation. When one bold boy asked how many times Preston had been shot at, Katherine quickly redirected the conversation to less violent topics, but with humor rather than harsh reprimand. Afterward, as the children filed out, Katherine approached him with obvious pleasure. "That was wonderful. You should have seen how engaged they were. Half of them will probably go home tonight and actually listen to their fathers about ranch work instead of complaining about chores." "They're good kids," Preston admitted. "Ask smart questions. They liked you. You have a way of explaining things clearly without talking down to them." Katherine gathered papers from her desk. "I'm getting supper at the hotel tonight since Mrs. Henderson is visiting her sister. Would you join me? My treat, as payment for your time." Preston knew he should refuse. Should maintain his boundaries and avoid any situation that might lead to expectations or entanglements. But Katherine's easy manner, the way she'd phrased it as payment rather than something more personal, made it seem harmless. "All right, but I'll pay my own way." The hotel dining room was busy with the evening crowd. Ranchers and businessmen and families all crowded around tables. Preston and Katherine found a corner spot, and over beef stew and fresh bread. Their conversation ranged from teaching methods to the politics of land management to books they'd both read. Katherine had opinions on everything but listened when challenged, adjusting her thinking when presented with new information rather than stubbornly clinging to being right. "You're not what I expected," Preston said finally, surprising himself with the honesty. Katherine raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect? Someone who'd be gone by winter. Someone who talked about wanting frontier life but didn't understand what that actually meant." And now, he studied her sun-touched face, her capable hands, the directness in her eyes. "You're still here." "I told you I keep my promises, Preston." She used his first name naturally, without asking permission. I promised myself I'd build a real life here, and I promised the school board I'd teach for at least 3 years. I don't break my word. 3 years isn't forever." "No," Katherine agreed softly, "but it's a start." They began sharing supper once a week, a routine that developed without discussion or decision. Sometimes at the hotel, sometimes at Preston's ranch where Mrs. Chen clearly approved of the arrangement, once at the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson presided over the meal like a benevolent chaperone. They talked about everything and nothing, and Preston found himself looking forward to those evenings with an anticipation he didn't want to examine too closely. By autumn, Katherine had become a fixture in Pico's society. The school was thriving, the children were learning, and even the most skeptical parents admitted she was the best teacher they'd ever had. She'd made friends with several ranch wives, helped organize a church social, and learned to shoot well enough to handle the rifle she kept at the schoolhouse for protection. Preston watched her integration into town life with conflicting emotions. Part of him admired her competence and determination. Part of him waited for the inevitable departure, for the day when frontier hardships would outweigh her commitment, and she'd pack her bags like everyone else eventually did. The first real test came in October when an influenza outbreak swept through Pico's. Half the town fell ill, including Katherine's landlady and most of her students. The school closed temporarily, and Katherine immediately volunteered to help Doc Morrison care for the sick. Preston heard about it from his foreman and rode into town against his better judgment, finding Katherine at the doctor's office helping to organize medicine distribution. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her face lit up when she saw him. "Preston, are you well?" "I'm fine." "My men too." He studied her tired face. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "I'm all right, just busy. So many people need help." "When did you last eat?" Katherine blinked, clearly trying to remember. "I had breakfast, I think." Preston took her arm firmly. "Come on. You're having a proper meal before you collapse." She protested, but lacked the energy to truly resist. At the hotel restaurant, Preston ordered enough food for both of them and watched as Katherine ate with the mechanical efficiency of someone running on pure determination. "You can't help anyone if you make yourself sick," he said quietly. "I know. I just keep thinking about the children, about their families. Some of them have so little already." Her eyes met his. "I can't leave them to manage alone." "You're one person, Katherine. You can't save everyone." "No. But I can try to help." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "That's what staying means, Preston. Not just being physically present when times are good, but choosing to remain when things get difficult, showing up for people when they need you." Her words hit harder than she probably intended, cutting through his defenses to the wounded child still living inside him. His mother had left when things got difficult. So had everyone else who'd ever mattered. But Katherine was different. She was choosing the hard path, the uncomfortable reality, the burden of caring. He turned his hand over, gripping her fingers. "Let me help. Tell me what Doc Morrison needs." Together they worked through the outbreak. Preston supplied beef for soup, organized his ranch hands to deliver firewood to families running low, personally checked on remote homesteads where the illness might go unnoticed until too late. He and Katherine became an unexpected team, coordinating efforts with Doc Morrison and the other volunteers, working late into the evenings and starting again at dawn. One night, Preston found Katherine asleep at the doctor's desk, her head pillowed on her arms, a half-written list of patients still needing visits beside her. He watched her for a long moment, taking in the vulnerability of her sleeping face, the dust on her dress, the ink stains on her fingers. Something cracked in his chest, something he'd kept frozen and protected for 20 years. He covered her with his coat, and settled into the chair beside the desk, keeping watch until morning. When the epidemic finally broke 3 weeks later, the town had lost 2 elderly residents and a newborn baby, but far fewer than they'd feared. At the memorial service, the preacher praised the community's response, specifically mentioning Katherine and Preston's tireless work. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his pew, unused to public recognition, but Katherine's hand found his and squeezed gently. After the service, as people dispersed to their homes and lives, Preston and Katherine walked slowly toward the boarding house. The November air was cool, a relief after weeks of stuffy sick rooms and worry. "You surprised me," Katherine said softly. "The way you stepped up to help. Why, you think I'm heartless?" "No, but I know you keep yourself separate, protected." Helping meant letting yourself care about people, risk feeling something if we'd lost them. She stopped walking, turning to face him on the quiet street. That was brave. Preston looked down at her upturned face, at the woman who'd somehow slipped past every defense he'd built. "You make me want to try," he admitted roughly. "Want to believe that maybe not everyone leaves." "I'm not leaving, Preston." Katherine's voice was fierce, certain. "I promise you that. I'm staying right here in Pecos, building my life, keeping my commitments. And if you'll let me, I'd like you to be part of that life." He should have been terrified, should have retreated back into his protective solitude. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, with this brave, stubborn, remarkable woman looking at him like he mattered, Preston found himself believing. "I'd like that too." Katherine smiled, brilliant and warm, and when Preston bent to kiss her, she met him halfway. Courting Katherine Walsh was unlike anything Preston had experienced in his carefully controlled life. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them. She challenged him when she thought he was wrong, laughed at him when he took himself too seriously, and pushed him to engage with the world beyond his ranch boundaries. She was also tender and thoughtful, remembering small details about his life, bringing him books she thought he'd enjoy, sitting in comfortable silence on his porch while the sun set over the Texas plains. The town watched their developing relationship with interest and approval. Mrs. Henderson beamed every time Preston came to call. Doc Morrison made pointed comments about settling down and having children. Even Preston's ranch hands seemed pleased, their boss's improved mood making life easier for everyone. But as winter approached and their relationship deepened, Preston felt old fears creeping back. Katherine talked about the future, about plans and hopes and dreams, and each conversation tightened the knot of anxiety in his chest. She'd promised to stay, but promises had been broken before. The closer he let her get, the more it would destroy him when she inevitably left. It came to a head in December, during the first real cold snap of winter. Preston and Katherine were having supper at his ranch when she mentioned casually that she'd been offered a teaching position at a prestigious girls' academy in Boston. The school's board had been impressed with her credentials and wanted her to start in the spring. Preston's fork clattered against his plate. "You're leaving?" Katherine looked up in surprise. "What? No, I turned them down weeks ago. I only mentioned it because it was flattering to be asked." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, standing abruptly. "But you were considering it. You were thinking about going." "Preston, I wasn't considering it at all. I barely read the full letter before writing back to decline." Her voice remained calm, but confusion and hurt crossed her face. "I'm happy here. This is my home now. For now, until something better comes along. Until frontier life gets too hard or too lonely or too boring." He was pacing, years of buried pain rising to the surface. "Everyone leaves eventually, Katherine. Everyone. I'm not everyone." She stood too, her voice gaining strength. "I'm me, and I've told you repeatedly that I'm staying." What do I have to do to make you believe me? You can't, the words burst out of him. You can't promise forever. People change their minds, circumstances change, feelings fade. My mother promised my father forever, and she was gone 3 days after he died. She promised me she'd always take care of me, and she left me with relatives who didn't want me. I learned young that promises are just words people say when it's convenient. Tears filled Catherine's eyes, but her voice remained steady. Your mother broke your heart, and I'm truly sorry for that pain. But I am not her, Preston. I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't make commitments I won't honor. You say that now. I say it now, and I'll say it every day for the rest of our lives if that's what you need to hear. She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I love you. I love your wounded heart and your careful distance and the way you're trying so hard to protect yourself from being hurt again. But I love you enough to fight through that fear, to prove to you through every action and choice that I'm not going anywhere. Preston's throat tightened. What if you're wrong? What if something happens and you change your mind? Then I'd tell you honestly and we'd work through it together. But Preston, I won't change my mind about this, about you, about us. I choose you and I choose this life and I'm choosing it every single day. That's my promise to you, not just words but action, over and over for as long as we both live. He wanted to believe her so desperately it hurt. People don't keep promises like that. Then I'll be the first one who does. Catherine's thumbs brushed away tears on his cheeks that he hadn't realized had fallen. Trust me, please. I know it's terrifying, but trust me anyway. Preston closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her hands, the absolute certainty in her voice. He thought about the past months, about how Katherine had shown up consistently, had worked tirelessly during the epidemic, had integrated herself into Pico's life with determination and grace. She'd had opportunities to leave and hadn't taken them. She'd faced hardship and difficulty and chosen to stay. Maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. He opened his eyes and found her watching him with such love and patience that something inside him finally broke open. I love you too, he said hoarsely, and I'm terrified of losing you. You won't lose me. I promise, Preston. I promise I'll stay. She pulled him into her arms and he held her tightly, breathing in her familiar scent, letting himself believe in possibility. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other while the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. Finally, Katherine pulled back enough to look at him. Ask me. Ask you what? You know what? Ask me the question you're afraid to ask. Preston's heart hammered. It's too soon. We haven't been courting that long. We've been building toward this since the day we met. Ask me, Preston. He swallowed hard, then slowly dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Katherine Walsh, will you marry me? Will you stay here with me, build a life with me, grow old with me on this ranch? Yes. Her answer came without hesitation, clear and certain. Yes to all of it. Forever. They were married in January of 1879 in the small church in Pecos with the whole town in attendance. Katherine wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, simple but elegant, and carried wildflowers that wouldn't bloom until spring, but that she'd crafted from fabric and wire with patient skill. Preston wore his best suit and couldn't stop looking at his bride, barely hearing the preacher's words through the thundering of his own heart. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Katherine with all the hope and fear and desperate love in his soul, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, sealing the promise they'd made. The reception at the hotel was lively, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Preston's ranch hands congratulated him with genuine warmth. Doc Morrison gave Katherine away in place of her distant family, his eyes suspiciously wet. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Chen had clearly collaborated on the celebration. both women beaming as they watched their respective charges embark on married life. As the evening wore on and Preston watched Katherine laugh with neighbors and dance with ranch children and accept congratulations with gracious warmth, he felt the last of his protective walls crumbling. She was here, she was his, and she'd chosen this life freely and fully. Late that night at the ranch that was now their shared home, Katherine stood at the bedroom window looking out at the moonlit landscape. Preston came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, only half joking. Katherine leaned back against him. "Not even for a second. This is exactly where I want to be. It won't always be easy. Ranch life is hard, sometimes isolating. There will be droughts and hard winters and difficult years." "I know." She turned in his arms, her expression serious. "And I'll be here through all of it." "That's what marriage means, Preston. Staying through the hard parts, not just enjoying the good ones. I need you to hear me and believe me when I say this. I'm not going anywhere. Ever." Preston cupped her face, seeing the absolute conviction in her eyes. "I believe you," he said, and meant it. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trusting that." "Good." Katherine smiled. "Because I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it." The first year of marriage tested Katherine's promise in unexpected ways. Spring brought torrential rains that flooded the creek and damaged several outbuildings. Summer scorched the grasslands, forcing Preston to buy feed he'd hoped to produce himself. In August, Katherine suffered a miscarriage that left them both grieving for the child they'd briefly hoped for. Through all of it, Katherine stayed. She worked beside Preston to repair flood damage, her hands blistered from wielding hammer and saw. She helped stretch the ranch budget when money was tight, finding creative ways to economize without sacrificing quality. When she lost the baby, she allowed herself to grieve but didn't let the sorrow consume her, and she held Preston when he cried in the darkness, his own grief compounded by fear that the loss might make her regret their life together. "Are you all right?" she asked him one night, weeks after the miscarriage. "I should be asking you that. I'm sad, but I'll heal. We both will. But Preston, I need you to tell me you're not waiting for me to leave because of this." He was silent for a long moment, then admitted quietly, "The thought crossed my mind. That maybe you'd decide a ranch in Texas wasn't where you wanted to raise children after all." Katherine took his hand, placing it over her heart. "Feel that. That's me, alive and present and committed to this life. To you. Yes, losing the baby hurt. But it doesn't change anything about where I want to be or who I want to be with. We'll have other chances or we won't, and either way we'll build the life we're meant to have, together." Preston pulled her close, breathing in her steadiness, her strength, her unwavering presence. "I love you." "I love you too, and I'm staying. Always." The seasons turned, and Katherine's promise held true. She continued teaching, though she cut back her hours to help more with ranch operations. Preston found himself relying on her judgment, trusting her insights about everything from horse breeding to business decisions to which ranch hands to hire. They became true partners, each strengthening the other's weaknesses, celebrating each other's successes. In the spring of 1880, Katherine became pregnant again. This time, she carried the baby to term, and on a cool November evening, she delivered a healthy boy. Preston held his son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the tiny life they'd created, terrified by how much more he now had to lose. "Look at us," Katherine said from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "We're a family, Preston. We need to name him." Preston couldn't look away from the baby's miniature features. "What about Daniel? After your father?" Preston's throat tightened. He told Katherine about his father during one of their long evening conversations, about the good man who tried to build something lasting, who died before he could see his vision fulfilled. "Daniel Everhart, I like that. Katherine smiled. "He'll stay too, you know. Not just because he's young and dependent, but because we'll teach him the value of commitment and keeping promises. We'll show him how to build a life worth staying for." Over the next several years, Katherine proved her promise in countless small ways. She stayed when their second son, Matthew, arrived in 1882, and the sleepless nights seemed endless. She stayed when a bad winter in 1883 killed 20 head of cattle and strained their finances to the breaking point. She stayed when her mother fell ill back in Philadelphia, and Katherine had to choose between a brief visit east or staying to help Preston through spring calving. She made the visit, but she came back exactly when she'd promised, refusing her family's pleas to stay longer. "How did you leave?" Preston asked when she returned, holding her tight in their bedroom. "How did you walk away from your mother when she's sick?" "Because my life is here now," Katherine said simply. "I love my mother and I was glad to see her, but my home is with you and our boys." "That's the choice I made when I married you, Preston. This is where I belong." In 1885, Katherine finally gave up teaching entirely when their third child, a daughter they named Sarah, arrived. The town organized a celebration of Katherine's 7 years of service, presenting her with a handmade quilt featuring squares stitched by every family she'd taught. Katherine cried as she accepted it, thanking everyone for welcoming her to Pico's and making it truly home. "You've given this town more than education," Mayor Thompson said during the ceremony. "You've shown all of us what commitment looks like. You promised to stay 3 years and you stayed 7. That's the kind of integrity we need out here." Preston watched his wife accept the praise with characteristic grace, and his heart swelled with pride and love. She'd kept every promise she'd ever made, not just to him but to the entire community. She'd woven herself so thoroughly into the fabric of Pico's life that he couldn't imagine the town without her. That night, after the children were asleep, Preston and Katherine sat on their porch watching the stars. The ranch spread around them, prosperous and growing, a testament to their combined efforts. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked quietly. "Staying here, giving up teaching, choosing this life?" Katherine looked at him in genuine surprise. "Never, not once. You still doubt me, Preston?" "No." And it was true. Somewhere over the years, his fear had transformed into certainty. "I just wanted to hear you say it. I'll say it as many times as you need to hear it. I'm happy, Preston, truly, completely happy. This ranch, this town, our children, this is everything I wanted and more than I dreamed of finding." She took his hand. "I promised I'd stay forever, and I meant it. Every day I wake up and choose this life again. That's what love is." Preston raised her hand to his lips. "I spent so long believing no one would stay, believing I wasn't worth staying for. And now I know better. You taught me that some promises are kept, that some people mean what they say, that love can be permanent if both people choose it every day." He pulled her close. "Thank you for staying, Katherine. Thank you for being patient while I learned to trust it." She kissed him softly. "Thank you for letting me stay, for opening your heart despite the fear, for building this beautiful life with me." The years continued to pass, each one adding new texture to their life together. Daniel grew tall and serious like his father, learning ranch management with careful attention to detail. Matthew inherited his mother's easy charm and love of learning, constantly reading books Katherine ordered from back east. Sarah proved to be a perfect blend of both parents, practical and affectionate, with a gift for handling horses that impressed even Preston's most experienced hands. In 1890, when Preston turned 42, Katherine organized a surprise party that brought together everyone whose lives they'd touched over the years. Former students, now grown and starting families of their own, came to thank the teacher who'd given them their start. Ranch hands passed and present raised glasses to the fair boss, who'd always kept his word. Neighbors spoke about Preston and Katherine's generosity during hard times, their willingness to help anyone who needed it. Preston stood in the center of the celebration, surrounded by community and family, and felt the full weight of what he and Katherine had built together. Not just the successful ranch or the healthy children, but something less tangible and infinitely more valuable, a life of meaning, connection, and fulfilled promises. Speech. Someone called and others took up the chant. Preston raised his hands for quiet, uncomfortable with public speaking, but knowing he needed to acknowledge this moment. I'm not good with words like my wife, but I'll say this. 20 years ago, I didn't believe in much of anything. I thought people were fundamentally unreliable, that promises were just convenient lies, that the only safe path was solitude. He found Katherine in the crowd, her eyes bright with tears. Then a stubborn woman showed up in my life and insisted on proving me wrong. She promised to stay, and she kept that promise. Every day for 12 years, she's chosen this life, chosen me, chosen us. Everything good in my life flows from that one kept promise. Katherine pushed through the crowd to his side, and Preston pulled her close. So this celebration isn't really about me. It's about her. About the woman who taught me that some promises do last forever if you're brave enough to keep them. The crowd erupted in applause, and Katherine buried her face in Preston's shoulder, overwhelmed. When she looked up, her face was wet with happy tears. "You believed me," she whispered. "You finally truly believed me." "Years ago," Preston confirmed, "but I wanted you to hear me say it publicly. You kept your promise, Katherine, you stayed, and you made everything beautiful." Life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm. Preston and Katherine worked together to expand their holdings, buying adjacent land when it became available, investing in better breeding stock, building a reputation for quality that brought buyers from across Texas and beyond. Their children grew strong and capable, learning the value of hard work and kept commitments from their parents' example. In 1895, when Katherine turned 40, Preston commissioned a portrait of their family. The painter captured them on the ranch porch, Preston tall and weathered but content, Katherine still beautiful with silver threading her blonde hair, the children arranged around them in descending height. When the portrait was finished, Preston hung it over the fireplace in the main room. "So everyone who enters this house knows what matters most," he explained to Katherine. "Family, commitment, promises kept." Katherine studied the portrait with obvious emotion. "We built something lasting, didn't we? Something that will continue after we're gone." "We did. You did." Preston wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You planted roots so deep nothing can shake them now." As the children grew older and began making their own paths, Preston and Katherine's bond only deepened. Daniel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county and started building his own small spread on a portion of Preston and Katherine's land. Matthew surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, studying in Austin but returning to Pecos to practice, wanting to serve the community his parents loved. Sarah showed no interest in leaving, instead taking over more of the ranch operations and proving to be a natural at horse training. "Our children are staying," Katherine observed one evening in 1898, watching Sarah work with a difficult mare. "Not because they have to, but because they want to. We taught them well." Preston nodded, feeling profound satisfaction. "We showed them what commitment looks like. What it means to build something worth keeping." That winter, Pecos experienced its worst blizzard in decades. Snow piled against buildings, wind howled for 3 days straight, and temperatures dropped so low that water froze in covered buckets. Preston and Katherine worked around the clock to keep the livestock alive, to maintain heat in the house. To ensure their children and grandchildren, Daniel had 2 young sons, by then remained safe. On the third night, exhausted and ice-covered, Preston stumbled into the kitchen to find Katherine making coffee with the last of their firewood. She looked as tired as he felt, her face drawn, but she smiled when she saw him. "Still here," she said, repeating the words that had become a private joke between them over the years. "Still here," Preston confirmed, pulling her into his arms despite their wet, frozen clothes. 20 years of promises kept, Katherine. 20 years of you choosing to stay through everything, hard times and good, sickness and health, prosperity and struggle. And I'll keep choosing it," Katherine said firmly. "Every day until my last day. That's my promise to you, Preston. Not just staying physically, but staying emotionally, spiritually, completely. You and me together always." The blizzard broke the next morning, revealing a transformed landscape of white and ice. Preston and Katherine stood on their porch, surveying the damage they'd need to repair, the work that lay ahead. But they faced it together, as they had everything else, and Preston knew with absolute certainty that they would handle whatever came next. Years continued their steady march. Preston's hair went completely gray, then white. Katherine developed arthritis in her hands but refused to slow down, finding new ways to contribute even when some tasks became difficult. They celebrated anniversaries and grandchildren's births, weathered droughts and market downturns, attended funerals of old friends and welcomed new families to Pico's. In 1905, on their 26th wedding anniversary, Preston took Katherine back to the spot where he'd first found her beside the broken-down stagecoach. The area had changed, a proper road ran through now, and homesteaders had built cabins on what had been empty land, but Preston could still picture that first meeting with perfect clarity. "I was so determined to stay unmoved by you," Preston admitted, holding Katherine's hand as they stood in the summer heat. "Convinced you'd leave like everyone else, and I was determined to prove you wrong." Katherine smiled at the memory. "It worked out well for both of us." "It worked out perfectly." Preston turned to face her, this woman who had transformed his life through the simple act of keeping her word. "You promised to stay, and you kept that promise forever, Katherine. Every single day you've been right here beside me. I don't have words for what that means, for how completely you healed something I thought was permanently broken." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "You gave me something too, Preston. You gave me purpose and home and a love deeper than I ever imagined. Keeping my promise was easy because this is exactly where I've wanted to be. You made it worth staying." They stood together in the place where their story began, two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other through every test and trial. The sun beat down on the Texas landscape, unforgiving and beautiful, and Preston thought about how perfectly Katherine fit into this hard land, how thoroughly she belonged. As they grew older, Preston and Katherine settled into a comfortable rhythm. They handed over more of the ranch operations to Sarah and her husband, a good man she'd married in 1903, while Daniel managed his own growing spread and Matthew balanced legal work with helping the family business. The ranch that Preston had built alone now employed 3 generations, a legacy of kept promises and steady commitment. In 1910, Preston and Katherine celebrated their grandchildren's achievements, their children's successes, their own 53 and 51 years of life, respectively. They sat on their porch most evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, content in the life they'd built together. "Do you remember when you didn't believe anyone would stay?" Katherine asked one evening, her voice soft in the twilight. "I remember thinking I was doomed to be alone," Preston replied. "That was before you showed me what real commitment looked like. I just kept my word. That's all I ever did. You did more than that. You transformed everything." Preston raised her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles gnarled with arthritis but still strong. "You promised to stay, and you kept that promise forever, Katherine, and in doing so, you gave me forever too." The years rolled on, each one precious. They watched great-grandchildren arrive, saw the ranch continue to prosper under the next generation's care, witnessed Pecos grow from a rough frontier town into an established community. Through all of it, Preston and Katherine remained at the heart of their family, the example everyone looked to for what love and commitment truly meant. In the spring of 1915, Preston fell ill with pneumonia. For weeks he battled the infection, and Katherine never left his side, sleeping in a chair beside their bed, spooning broth into him during his lucid moments, holding his hand through the fevered nightmares. The children urged her to rest, to let others help, but Katherine refused. "I promise to stay beside him always," she said firmly. "That includes now especially." Preston recovered slowly, and as his strength returned, he watched Katherine with renewed wonder. She was 70 years old now, her face lined with age, her body not as strong as it once was. But her spirit remained unbreakable, her commitment absolute. "You're still here," he said one morning as she helped him sit up in bed. "Always," Katherine replied, smiling. "Did you really think I'd go anywhere?" "No," Preston admitted. "Not anymore, not ever really." "You proved yourself years ago, Katherine. You've stayed through everything, through my fear and doubt, through hard times and good, through sickness and health. You kept your promise. And I always will. Until my last breath, Preston, I'll be right here beside you." They had 5 more good years together. Years filled with love and laughter and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. They watched their legacy continue to grow, saw their values pass to yet another generation, knew that what they'd built together would endure long after they were gone. Preston died peacefully in his sleep in January of 1920, at the age of 71. Katherine woke beside him as she had for 41 years and knew immediately that he was gone. She held his hand, tears streaming down her face, but her heart was full rather than broken. They'd had a lifetime together, every day a renewed choice to stay, to love, to keep the promises they'd made. At Preston's funeral, the church overflowed with family and friends, with people whose lives had been touched by the Everharts' example. Katherine sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and listened as person after person spoke about Preston's integrity, his fairness, his deep capacity for love once he'd learned to trust it. When it was her turn to speak, Katherine stood slowly, her body frail but her voice still strong. Preston Everhart was a man who had been hurt deeply, who had learned not to trust in permanence or promises. But he gave me a chance to prove him wrong, and I spent 41 years showing him that some promises really are forever. We built a beautiful life together, based on commitment and trust, and the simple choice to stay through everything. That's what I hope you'll remember about both of us, that we chose each other every single day, and in doing so, we created something lasting. She paused, looking at the sea of faces, seeing Preston's legacy in every person present. He believed no one would stay. I promised I would, and I kept that promise forever. And now, even though he's gone from this earth, I'm still keeping it. He's in my heart, in our children, in this ranch we built together, in this community we served. That's what staying means. Not just being physically present, but leaving a mark so deep that it never fades. Katherine lived 6 more years, remaining on the ranch surrounded by family, still offering wisdom and guidance to anyone who sought it. She spoke often about Preston, keeping his memory alive for the youngest generation who had never known him. She told stories about their courtship, their early struggles, the way they'd learned to trust and love and build together. On a warm spring evening in 1926, Katherine sat on the porch she and Preston had shared for so many years, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant colors. Sarah sat beside her, holding her mother's hand. "Are you comfortable, Mama?" Sarah asked gently. "Very comfortable. Very content." Katherine smiled. "I kept my promise, you know. All these years I stayed. Through everything I chose this life, this place, this family, and I've never regretted it for even a moment. Daddy knew that. He believed you completely. It took time, but yes, he did. And that belief, that trust we built together, that was the foundation of everything good in our lives." Katherine squeezed her daughter's hand. "Make sure you remember that, Sarah. Make sure you teach your children. Promises matter. Commitment matters. Staying through the hard times matters. That's how you build something that lasts." "I will, Mama, I promise." Katherine closed her eyes, still smiling. "Good. That's good." She died peacefully that night in the bed she'd shared with Preston for so many years, surrounded by the family they'd created together. The town of Pecos mourned the loss of a woman who had given them so much, who had exemplified the best of frontier strength and feminine grace, who had shown everyone what it meant to keep a promise no matter what. They buried Katherine beside Preston on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky so vast and blue it seemed to go on forever. The entire community attended, along with family members who traveled from across Texas and beyond. The preacher spoke about faithfulness and commitment, and the extraordinary love story of two people who had chosen each other against all odds. As the service concluded and people slowly dispersed, 3 generations of Everharts remained at the graveside. Daniel, now 66 and still managing his own ranch. Matthew, 64 and still practicing law in Pecos. Sarah, 61 and running the main ranch with her husband and children. Around them clustered grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all bearing the legacy of Preston and Katherine's kept promises. "They really did it," Matthew said softly. "They built something forever." "They did," Sarah agreed. "Mama promised to stay, and she kept that promise every single day. And in doing so, she taught all of us what real love looks like." Daniel nodded, looking at the 2 graves side by side. "Daddy stopped believing anyone would stay. Mama proved him wrong, and together they created all of this." He gestured at the assembled family, the thriving ranch in the distance, the community that had been shaped by their example. "We need to make sure their story doesn't get forgotten," Sarah said. "That future generations know what they did, what they built together." "It won't be forgotten," Matthew assured her. "Look around. We're living proof of their love story. Every one of us exists because Mama kept her promise, because she taught Daddy to trust again, because they chose each other every single day for 4 decades. That's not a story that fades. That's a legacy that lasts forever." And he was right. The Everhart name continued to be respected throughout West Texas, synonymous with integrity and commitment and kept promises. The ranch prospered through the decades, passed down through generations who had learned from Preston and Katherine's example. In Pecos, people still told stories about the teacher from Philadelphia who had promised to stay 3 years and stayed her entire life, and the wounded rancher she'd taught to believe in forever. The 2 graves on the hill overlooked the land they'd built together, the legacy they'd created, the family that continued their values. And if you visited on a quiet evening when the wind whispered through the grass and the sunset painted the sky, you might almost hear 2 voices, still promising each other the same words they'd spoken so many times in life, still here, still staying, still choosing each other. Forever.